While observing the conflict in Ukraine, you can hear that one side captures this settlement, there is fighting for that settlement, and this and that place were shelled by artillery and so forth. So, have you wondered if it would be great if all the separate events would be put into a system that would be able to make sense of them? That is exactly what I thought. In this video, I will use the different events of the campaign in the Donbas and attempt to explain them by using general military logic. Well, anyway, I will do my best to do that. Because remember, despite my efforts, I am just a YouTuber and the following is just my opinion. With disclaimers out of the way, let's pull up the map and get started. First, I must address the strategies of both sides. In February and March of 2022, the Russian forces invaded Ukraine and occupied part of its territory. The goal of Ukraine was to drive the Russian forces out and retake the occupied territory. But how could Ukraine have any hope of doing that if the Russian army was stronger and was advancing and taking more land? Well, here comes the first explanation by using military logic. You usually need some advantage over the enemy to attack and capture territory. At that moment, Russia had the advantage and its troops were attacking. But the Ukrainian troops had the defensive advantage, and this meant that when the Russian forces attacked, they were suffering more losses than the Ukrainian side. As a result, when Russia advanced, it captured Ukrainian territory, but its forces also suffered losses and became weaker compared to the Ukrainian side. Ukraine made it its goal to be on the defensive until the Russians had lost so much of their resources during the attacks that they had lost their advantage and it passed to the Ukrainian side. Then Ukraine would gain the ability to counterattack and regain the occupied territories. The Russian war goal suited the Ukrainian plan, as it was to attack the Ukrainian forces in the territory known as the Donbas. Because of time constraints, I will not look at fighting in the whole of the Donbas, but only in the territory which saw most of the fighting, which is this area. This is the same area on a more large-scale map. Before we go into action, we need to address three things that influence the fighting. You can see that there is a gradient from light to dark colors. This is the height map. The lighter the color, the higher the part of the terrain. In warfare, it is usually good to have your troops stationed on the higher parts of terrain, because you can see better and shoot downwards from there. For this reason, it is more difficult to attack from darker areas into the lighter ones. The orange is the urban terrain. This basically means areas where there are houses. Compared to open terrain, houses provide cover to the soldiers from enemy fire, and they also provide good positions from where to shoot at the enemy. This means that these areas are very easy to defend from all directions. Finally, let's see the Russian tactics. The Ukrainian forces had the defensive advantage, and if the Russian forces attacked them, they would suffer large casualties from Ukrainian fire. The Russians therefore decided to use their advantage in the artillery and bomb the Ukrainian positions with artillery shells until they were mostly destroyed, and only then sent the assault forces to capture them. But the problem with these tactics was that it would take a week or more to destroy the Ukrainian positions with artillery bombardment, and this made the Russian advance to be slow. Anyway, let's get into the action. In March and April, Russian forces launched several attacks outside the area of interest. After these attacks had not had the intended success, Russia changed its strategy in late April and launched a two-pronged attack west of Lysychansk-Severodonetsk. We will first look at the Russian offensive in the south. In the south, the main obstacle for Russia was the urban area of Popasna-Hirska. The first Russian goal was to take the town of Popasna, which was located on the dominating heights. They concentrated their artillery fire on the town, and after some weeks of bombardment, the town and Ukrainian defenses in it were destroyed. By the start of the second week of May, the Russian forces took control of it. The Russians used the rest of May to secure the heights that Popasna was dominating, but then they ran into the second Ukrainian defensive line, which the Ukrainians had meanwhile constructed. In the south, the Ukrainian defenses were anchored on the two artificial lakes. They then went north along the string of villages which blocked the movement west of Popasna. Then it went along the Ukrainian strongpoints in the towns of Bakhmutske, Yakovlivka and Berestove. The direction north of Popasna was covered by the settlements of Vrubivka and the dual settlement of Kumyshevacha. In the east, the defense was anchored onto a large urban area of Hirske Zolote on a dominating height. During the second half of May, the Russian forces continued to advance north and attempted to breach the second Ukrainian defensive line, but they ran into a strong resistance near Berestove and their attack was repelled. By the beginning of June, they had been forced to fall back. At the same time, the Russians undertook an offensive from the north. Here, their main obstacle was the Siversky Donets River. The Russians easily overcame the weak first Ukrainian defensive line and occupied the towns of Kreminna and Liman. They then reached the Siversky Donets River. One of the defensive benefits of a river is that when something takes place on the river, it is well seen by the defending side. The Russians set up temporary bridges on the river and began transporting their forces to the other shore, but they were spotted by the Ukrainians, whose artillery began shelling the area heavily. As a result, the bridges were destroyed and a lot of Russian tanks were lost. This was such a costly failure for the Russians that they gave up on crossing the Siversky Donets River. For this reason, they now concentrated on breaking through the southern Ukrainian defensive line. The Russians continued their attacks to the north of Popasna. Here, the towns of Komyshevacha, Vrubivka and Berestove dominated the heights and gave the Ukrainians good chance of defense. During the first week of June, the Russians attempted to pass between Berestove and Vrubivka, but got stuck. On the second week of the month, they assaulted in the east and were able to capture this part of Komyshevacha, which was in the valley, but the settlement on the hill still held back their progress. Finally, in the third week of the month, the Russians captured Vrubivka, and this forced the Ukrainians to abandon the remaining part of Komyshevacha. With that, the second line of Ukrainian defense was broken. Then the Russians launched an attack from the east. During the previous weeks, Ukraine had been forced to abandon its extended positions in the east. The Ukrainians took in defensive positions in the town of Toshivka. In the middle of June, the Russians launched a new offensive from here. It is unknown if the Ukrainian defenses were weak here or the Russian attack was strong, but in just a few days, the Russians captured not only Toshivka, but also the height and several villages. Now, two Russian forces were in position to link up over these heights without any major settlements in their way. Now it is time to explain some military logic. Now, the main logic for the Ukrainian side is to cause losses to Russians, while keep its own losses small. Here are large urban areas of Hirske Zolote located on the dominating heights. These are good for defense. If Russia attacked into the settlement from downhill, it would suffer large losses, while Ukraine would suffer small losses because of defensive advantage. This is good according to Ukrainian strategy. But Ukrainian forces need supplies and ammunition to continue the resistance. In fact, they would need so much of them that these would have to be continuously supplied and brought up. If Russian forces now cut off the Ukrainian supply line, then the Ukrainian forces in the towns could not get any more supplies. With the supplies at hand, they would be able to inflict some losses on the Russians, but after using them up, they would have to give up and surrender. This would mean very large losses for the Ukrainian side and small losses for the Russians. This was bad according to the Ukrainian strategy. So, in order to avoid this outcome, Ukraine decided to abandon these good defensive positions and withdrew its forces. Ukrainian forces pulled further back to a better defensive line. It started at Berestove, then went along the ridge to the Lysychansk oil refinery, and then around the southeast corner of Lysychansk. The Ukrainian forces had taken this position during the last days of June. Now, let's get back to military logic. You see, on paper, the Ukrainian defensive line was good, but just in some days, the Russians captured the central Ukrainian defensive positions, the Lysychansk oil refinery. This can be explained by the fact that retreat is considered to be a complicated maneuver, when things often go wrong. It is possible that something did not go by plan during the Ukrainian retreat from Hirske Zolote, and the Ukrainian forces could not fully man their defenses on the new line, and this allowed the Russian side to quickly capture the oil refinery. I don't know if this is a good explanation. The Lysychansk oil refinery was the last major defensive position that prevented the Russians from cutting off the Ukrainian supply lines to the cities of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. Now the same logic applies here as with the Zolote-Hirske encirclement earlier. Lysychansk and Severodonetsk are very large cities with lots of buildings that are very easy to defend, and Ukraine would want to keep control over them. But if the Russians cut the supply lines, the Ukrainian forces could only resist for a little time and would then have to surrender. Ukraine did not want this to happen, and they withdrew its forces out of Severodonetsk in late June and in the first week of July abandoned Lysychansk. The Ukrainian forces took positions on the ridge, while the Russian forces occupied the settlements in the valley. This was fighting north of Popasna up to July. Now we will look into fighting south of Popasna during this time. After the Russian breakthrough around Popasna, the Ukrainian forces had withdrawn from the slopes to a more defensible line on water obstacles. Their defenses here went as follows. The southernmost part of the front line was defended by the pre-war fixed fortifications. Then there was a strong point on the hill west of the artificial lake. Further north, the Russians had crossed the gap between the two artificial lakes, but their further progress was blocked off by an Ukrainian strongpoint around the Vuhlahirska power plant. On the height, there was the village of Rotte. Further north, the defensive terrain extended along the small villages until they reached the towns of Bakhmutske and Yakovlivka. By the first week of June, the Russian forces had advanced and captured the heights that were reaching forward from the Ukrainian positions. Then the line stabilized, and during the next month, the Russians were only able to take the villages of Rotte and Klunove and gain some ground west of the artificial lake. But in late July, they redoubled their effort and were able to take the heights west of the lake and also the Vuhlahirska power plant. The Russians were now continuing towards the Bakhmutka river valley with little defensive terrain, but their advance slowed down considerably. In August, they captured this area, in September this, in October this, and in November this. This progress from August to November was much slower than during the previous 4 months from April to July. There was no particularly good defensive terrain in this area, so there must be another explanation. So why did the Russian offensive slow down? Well, the Russian tactic was to destroy the Ukrainian defenses by firing artillery shells at them. There is some evidence that there was a reduction in the amount of Russian artillery fire during that time due to an ammunition shortage, which may be one of the causes for the lessened tempo of operations. But there are also articles that claim that the Russian munition situation was not problematic. So is there a munition shortage or not? Ground News will help to find it out. Ground News is the world's first news comparison platform. When looking at the same articles on this platform, one can see that the second story of Russia not having munitions problems has been covered by only one outlet, which is owned by the Russian government and is considered to have low factuality. This makes its authenticity questionable. The article that argues for ammunition shortages also suffers from some political bias, with it being covered by 2 left-wing outlets and no right-wing ones. But it is picked up by outlets with diverse ownership, which means that there is no single entity pushing its agenda. Also, the factuality rating of most of these outlets has been marked as high. So after seeing this data in context provided by Ground News, I find that it is more probable that Russia is suffering from an artillery ammunition shortage. Nowadays it is often impossible to get the full picture of the events just from one source. Let's use technology to move away from the old ways and upgrade to the new way to read the news. Check out Ground News by going to ground.news/history. By doing that, you will also support this channel. Thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Running low on artillery ammunition stocks was not the only problem the Russian offensive faced. Also, the newly arrived Ukrainian HIMARS artillery made it difficult for Russia to transport the shells to the front line. For this reason, the volume of the Russian artillery fire began to run lower, and it could not destroy the Ukrainian defensive positions at the same tempo. Russia had also lost soldiers during the operations, and because it had problems with men enlisting to its army, it ran into manpower shortages. Ukraine used the weakening of the Russian forces to launch a counter-offensive. By the end of summer, Russian manpower losses had grown to the extent that they did not have enough soldiers to fully man all of the front. On the most important directions, the front was well manned, but on directions considered secondary, weak spots appeared. Parts of the Russian front had become so weak that if Ukrainian forces gathered a large group of troops against a part of the Russian line, they could easily overrun this part of the front and break through. One of these weakly held lines was in this area. The offensive started on the 6th of September. The Ukrainian forces overran the Russian defenses north of Balaklia. The Russians lacked troops to react to this breakthrough. The Ukrainians drove behind the Russian lines and captured the town of Kupiansk. Now, until that time, the Ukrainians had broken through one of the weakest parts of the Russian line and had not engaged any strong Russian forces. The Russians had a chance to regroup around their strong positions and restore a defensive line. But if they held out, the Ukrainians could cut off the supply route to Russian units, which would eventually lead them to surrender. Russia did not want to allow this to happen, and they pulled back their forces to stop the Ukrainian advance over the Oskil River. By the beginning of the third week of September, the Russians had fallen back. This enabled the Russians to offer much stronger resistance to the Ukrainian forces, but the Ukrainian counteroffensive continued. During the third week of September, the Ukrainians crossed both the Oskil River and the Siversky Donets rivers. There was a good urban defensive terrain that went along the village of Yampil, the town of Liman, and the village of Novoselivka. The Ukrainian forces advanced along the Oskil River and then they turned east and outflanked the Russian defensive line. Then the Ukrainian forces proceeded towards the east and prepared to cut off the Russian supply route to Liman from the north. At the same time, the Ukrainian forces captured Yampil. By the end of September, the Ukrainian forces threatened to cut off the Russian supply line to their troops in Liman. Russia did not want to have its forces in Liman to be cut off and forced to surrender, and it withdrew them behind the Zherebets River. This became the new defensive line, and the Russian forces retreated behind the river along the whole front. By that time, Russia had declared mobilization, which meant that it could solve its manpower problems by forcefully recruiting soldiers to its army, and it also increased recruitment by other means. This fixed the main Russian weakness, and Ukraine had lost the advantage it had. Ukrainian forces could not advance anymore. They gained control over the villages in the Zherebets Valley, while the Russian forces remained in control of the heights. This situation would persist for at least several months. Now let's get back to our area of focus. With the mobilization and increase in manpower recruitment solving Russian manpower problems, the Russians changed their tactics in this area. Before, their advance was slowed down by a shortage of artillery shells. Now they compensated for the lack of shells by the increase in number of soldiers and began relying more on ground assaults to capture the Ukrainian positions. This helped to speed up the Russian advance. This improvement made the Russians set out to capture the city of Bakhmut. With Bakhmut consisting of many buildings, the only way to take it was to encircle it and cut the supply lines to the city. But this was easier said than done because the city itself was surrounded by considerable urban terrain. The way west of the city was blocked off by the town of Chasiv Yar and the village of Ivanivska. To the northeast of Bakhmut, the urban area extended through Krasna Hora and Soledar towards Bakhmutska and Yakovlevka. So in order to encircle Bakhmut, the Russians would have to overcome good defensive terrain. The Russian offensive began in mid-December. We will first look at the attack from the south. During the first 4 weeks of the offensive from mid-December to mid-January, the Russian progress here was slow. During late January and early February, they advanced up to Ivanivska, then their attack was completely stopped by the Ukrainian forces. The progress of this attack was underwhelming, but it still had distracted the Ukrainian forces long enough that the Russians had been able to make large progress with their northern attack. This is how it went. During the third week of December, the Russians took the Ukrainian strongpoint of Yakovlivka. During the last part of the month, they expanded their positions and also assaulted Bakhmutska, which fell to them during the first week of January. Then the Russians approached the town of Soledar from two sides. During the second week of January, they captured the eastern part of the town, and during the third week, they took the rest of it. By that time, they had reached the Bakhmutka river. Now, their last obstacle was the urban area of Krasna Hora. In the last part of January, the Russians crossed the Bakhmutka river near Soledar and occupied the heights overlooking Krasna Hora. During the first week of February, they moved out to outflank the Krasna Hora position and by the third week of the month had captured it. This made the Ukrainians retreat from the eastern part of Bakhmut to shorten their defensive line. Then the Russians seemed to advance west in an attempt to cut off the Ukrainian supply lines into Bakhmut. During the rest of February, they made these gains. During the first week of March, they advanced some more. But it seems like then their focus was changed to attacking Bakhmut directly. During the second week of March, they gained this territory, and this is what the front line looks like at the end of the fourth week of March, around the time of this video being finished. Hopefully this video will help you to put the many different events of the fighting in the Donbas into a better perspective. Having said that, this video is not of the same factual quality as my general history content, and there are still many things that we don't know for sure, and there are probably many mistaken assumptions in the video. In the next video, I will see you in the dusty deserts of North Africa, where the facts are much clearer.